vaccines were able to be developed so quickly in the first place is because they're kind of designed to slot in and out pieces of a virus to target. So I actually think for these vaccines that were developed, it's probably not that challenging to tweak that a little bit. This is something we do actually every year with the flu vaccine. That's why you get a new flu vaccine every year, because every year the flu is slightly different. And so we have to change the number of eggs, so to speak, in our recipe for the vaccine.
Now, one bit of good news is that the US have started their vaccination program. That started today. And Dr. Monsef Slaoui is the chief scientific advisor to the US vaccination plan, known as Operation Warp Speed. He told the BBC the aim was to vaccinate over 100 million people within the next few months.
The very first vaccine doses will be inoculated primarily to very old, frail people that are in long-term care facilities, as well as to the healthcare workers that are in the front line. And after that, we're targeting healthcare workers, first-line workers, and people over the age of 65. That's about 120 million people overall. And our plans is to be able to have vaccinated this population by the end of the month of March.
Now, Dr. Murray, this is a huge logistical challenge, isn't it? Vaccinating such a vast number of people.
Yeah, definitely the logistics of this are really challenging. But, I think this is something that public health and emergency response officials have sort of thought about for a long time. Organizations like FEMA and the CDC will have had plans in place for this kind of thing. And so I think, it's not something that's infeasible. I think things that we're going to want to watch out for is, how do we tell people that their time in the queue has arrived? How do we assure them that, this is the right, it's the right time for them to take the vaccine, and that they should be confident with it. I think, the other thing to remember is that 120 million people is a huge number of people, but that's, somewhere between a quarter and a third of the U.S. population. And, what we've seen from some of the vaccine modeling studies is that we may need up to 70% of the population vaccinated before COVID stops really circulating. And so I think the other thing we'll need to encourage people, have a conversation with, we still need to be wearing masks. We still need to be washing our hands, even as these 120 million doses people get vaccinated, because that's not, it will protect those people for sure, but it's not enough to protect the people who aren't yet vaccinated.
Dr. Eleanor Murray, thank you for your time as ever. She joins us every Monday here on OS. She's Assistant Professor of Epidemiology at Boston University School of Public Health. If you have any questions for Dr. Murray, you can get in touch via WhatsApp. You can send us an audio message. It's country code 4477 30 75 19 25. And each weekday here on OS, we have an expert here to answer your questions, to myth bust sometimes, and just really explain the inner details of this global pandemic that we're all living through right now. You're listening to OS on the BBC World Service.
This is the BBC World Service, where Edward Sturton is asking, could the coronavirus pandemic cause the breakup of the United Kingdom?
The union between Scotland, England, Wales and Northern Ireland was already showing signs of strain. And then along came COVID.
It would be very difficult to imagine just how big a constitutional crisis has emerged from what is a very problematic public health crisis.
It was supposed to be a battle fought from London, but on some matters, the devolved nations chose to go it alone.
Doing what was best for Northern Ireland, using the medical and scientific advice here and making decisions based on that evidence.
Has it left an appetite for more devolved powers? Could it even lead to Scotland breaking away?
Put independence together with Brexit, together with irritations over devolution, with the COVID pandemic, and you've got quite a political firestorm, if you like.
Disunion, Tuesday at 9 and 20 GMT.
Hello, this is Chloe Tilley on BBC OS. Welcome to the programme. We're continuing our conversations with frontline health workers all around the world by heading to Brazil shortly to hear from a doctor treating COVID patients. Now, in a country where the president has dismissed the virus as a little flu, we'll look at the impact his actions have had on health services there and examine the criticism of his failure to prepare a nationwide COVID vaccination programme.
BBC News with Neil Nunes. The country worst hit by coronavirus, the United States, has begun a mass vaccination program. An intensive care nurse, Sandra Lindsay, received the first injection in New York. The Pfizer-BioNTech shot was watched virtually by the state's governor, Andrew Cuomo, who said he hoped it gave her a sense of security, safety, and confidence. Many Americans remain skeptical about the vaccine. The British government is moving London to England's highest level of coronavirus restrictions, saying the rise in cases threatens to overwhelm hospitals. From Wednesday, the capital will close all catering outlets except for takeaway services. Mixing between households will be limited to outdoor spaces, and cultural facilities must shut. Schools, shops, and gyms will stay open. The investigative website Bellingcat says it has evidence that the Russian opposition activist Alexei Navalny was poisoned by an undercover Russian intelligence hit squad. It alleges an FSB team followed him on 30 trips, including to Siberia, where he fell into a coma in August after being given the nerve agent Novichok. The Kremlin has rubbished all accusations. South Korea has banned the sending of anti-Pyongyang leaflets into North Korea, ending an exercise that's gone on for decades. Activists tie leaflets to balloons and float them over the border. The new law has been criticized by human rights groups. After 2 decades of negotiations, efforts to limit harmful fishing subsidies have failed to meet an end-of-year deadline. The talks' chairman said the time had been lost because of coronavirus. And police in Uganda say 2 Nigerian singers, Omali and Thames, have been arrested and charged after performing shows likely to spread coronavirus. Thames's manager and 4 Ugandans were also detained following Saturday's event. BBC News.
Hello, welcome to OS on the BBC World Service. Chloe Tilley with you here for the next 30 minutes. Now, we bring you breaking and developing stories here on the programme, but we also speak to people who are from the areas directly affected by those stories. And in the next 10 minutes, we're going to head to Nigeria and hear the latest on the attack on a school by militants that's left confusion over the number of children kidnapped there. Nigerian government troops have surrounded the area where gunmen are thought to be holding the school children. Now, what we do know is around 400 boys remain unaccounted for. It's not clear if that many are being held by the gunmen. But we're going to play your WhatsApp messages, which have been coming into us throughout the course of the day from that area, to get your thoughts on that story. And we'll also be speaking to our correspondent as well. Now, on OS, we continue to look at how the coronavirus pandemic is affecting people's lives all around the world. And we often hear from frontline healthcare workers who are dealing with traumatic events on a daily basis whilst treating COVID patients. Today, we're heading to Brazil, where the politics and President Bolsonaro's handling of the outbreak have somewhat complicated things. More than 181,000 Brazilians have died from COVID-19. But in the past, the president has dismissed the severity of the disease, even calling it a little flu. Mr. Bolsonaro is also facing criticism over his failure to prepare a nationwide COVID vaccination programme. Well, we're going to connect with our reporter in Brazil in a moment. But first, let's hear from Dr. Gerson Salvador, an infectious disease specialist at the University Hospital of Sao Paulo in Brazil. He's been telling my colleague Ben James about the risks of coronavirus to himself and also his colleagues.
Last week, a friend of mine, 35 years guy, doctor, passed away with COVID-19. Unfortunately, he is not the only friend that I have lost. In Brazil, we have one of the worst scenarios around the world. And doctors, nurses, and healthcare professionals are one of the most vulnerable. Unfortunately, my friend passed away.
At 35 years old, had you spoken about the risk to yourselves?
Yeah, nowadays we have the personal protective equipment. We had problems with PPE in the beginning of the pandemic. It was a problem worldwide. But we have an uncontrolled situation in Brazil. In our best moment, we had about 300 deaths a day. So the figures are climbing up just now, but we don't have a second wave. We just have a kind of tsunami epidemic.
What does that mean for your work every day?
And in our work, we face very severe people, and we have more deaths between our black people. Almost 60% of our people are Afro-Brazilians, okay? And in our black population, we have the worst figures, as well as United States of America. And our situation is worse in our poor people. Unfortunately, almost 20% of Brazilian people live in very bad conditions. And in this population, the pandemic never has been controlled. Now, we have seen the figures worsening also in our private hospitals. It's difficult have intensive care beds for every people who needs it.
So you're running out of beds in intensive care?
Yeah.
Why would you say things are getting so bad?
It's a disaster, and the main culprit is President Bolsonaro, because we don't have a national organized response. Our minister is not a doctor or even a healthcare professional, it's a general, and the government don't have a coordinated response with the states and local governments. Our president minimized the situation and make jokes in social network about our problems. Unfortunately, Bolsonaro, as well Trump, they are responsible.
And we've heard lots of debates on this programme involving people who may support President Bolsonaro, may support President Trump, and we won't go over all of those debates right now, but suffice it to say, some point to the economy and say, well, we need to safeguard that. And of course, healthcare professionals like yourself would likely disagree with that interpretation. But on the subject of the national government in Brazil and the state governments, there's an interesting contrast, isn't there, in your state of São Paulo on the idea of the vaccine that is to come, because President Bolsonaro disagrees with your own state governor that a vaccine, in the governor's view in São Paulo, should be compulsory. What do you think about that?
From my point of view, this is not an individual choice. Immunization is a public choice because the immunization is not only about the people who receives the vaccine, but to protect the entire society, okay? So we need a deal around the country about the vaccines. We don't have to elect one of the vaccines. We have different good products, and we need to use them in a coordinated response to immunize our population in general.
So if somebody says, I do not want a vaccine in São Paulo, what do you think should happen to them? Should they be punished?
Yeah, the Brazilian law supports administrative punishment for people that does not take vaccines, but I essentially don't know how it could be managed in our situation where the federal government is in a kind of political war against the São Paulo government.
I understand. So that conflict between your local government and the national government would make it difficult to enforce that, even if the governor wanted it to happen.
Yeah, unfortunately, in the fight between our president and the governor of São Paulo, the winner is the coronavirus.
Which is so sad, whichever politics you have, if it means that more people are going to become ill and die. Do you think, though, that enough people will choose to have a vaccine when one becomes available? I have seen some research that suggests there are increasing levels of vaccine skepticism in Brazil, just as there are in some other parts of the world.
I think that people will take the vaccine as soon as it would be available. And I hope so that the propaganda from the President Bolsonaro does not impact our figures on immunization. And I hope so that our civil society, our scientific community, and even the international society can help us to fight against the fake news that unfortunately came from our president in Brazil.
How are you feeling, Doctor, after so many months of this, nearly a year of this, I suppose? You've lost friends, the work is long and hard. How does it leave you feeling?
Sometimes we feel tired, sometimes we feel sad. In the last 9 months, I've not seen my nephews, my sisters. It's not easy for us, but we have to be part of solution.
And that was Dr. Gerson Salvador, who's an infectious disease specialist at the University Hospital Sao Paulo in Brazil, speaking to my colleague here on OS, Ben James. Well, listening to that was our BBC Brazil colleague, Camila Mota, who joins us now from Sao Paulo. As you listen to that, Camila, do you think that really sums up the really tough time that so many healthcare professionals are having working in Brazil right now during this pandemic?
It definitely does, Chloe. And I'd also like to just give a little bit more of context, because things are sometimes so tricky here in Brazil, it's even hard for us to understand. As Jason was pointing out, Bolsonaro has been heavily criticized for not showing a consistent vaccination plan. And he had been attacking the governor of the state of São Paulo, João Dória, for reaching out to the Chinese and negotiating directly with them 46 million doses of the Coronavac. Dória, as we know, actually wants to run for president against Bolsonaro in 2 years, so vaccination in Brazil became sort of a political battlefield. The two of them kept clashing over the subject, and meanwhile, Bolsonaro was being more and more pressured, as other countries are already starting to vaccinate, to actually lay out a plan. So over the weekend, he presented what was supposed to be a vaccination program, but was completely filled with gaps. So that you guys have an idea, it covers only 25% of the Brazilian population, around 50 million people, and doesn't have a detailed schedule or logistics to provide raw materials for needles, syringes, etc. It doesn't even say when vaccination is supposed to start. So the current situation is the Supreme Court gave the government 48 hours to clarify these and other information. So we're waiting here anxiously.
And how do people respond to that lack of direction from their president?
Brazilians in general are very frustrated. Bolsonaro, as Dr. Gerson was pointing out, he's been downplaying the severity of the pandemic since its beginning. Of course, Bolsonaro counts with this small but really loud group of supporters, around 15% of the constituents. But truth is, the majority of the Brazilians are tired of the pandemic and really frustrated with the president.
Now, after what looked like a few months where things might be starting to get under control, there has been a rise in the number of cases, hasn't there? Is it clear why that is?
Yeah, actually, Chloe, the situation never got too comfortable here in Brazil. But after this really surge in the infection curve, we were living kind of in a plateau. the situation, the infection curve started what seemed to be a decreasing trend. But what we see now that was not the case, and worse, most Brazilians simply gave up social distancing. Many resumed their lives. So there's mounting concern that numbers could actually spike after Christmas and New Year. And as Dr. Gerson was saying, we're already seeing in some states hospital capacity get close to its limit once again, something that we saw happening 6 months ago. So the whole outlook here is quite worrying.
Camila Mota, BBC Brazil correspondent, thank you for that update from Sao Paulo. Chloe Tilley with you on OS from the BBC World Service. Here are a couple of stories on the BBC's Africa Live page. Police in Uganda say they've charged Nigerian singers Omale and Thames with, quote, negligently doing acts likely to spread an infectious disease. The singers had performed at an event in Kampala on Saturday that reportedly breached coronavirus rules. Lots of people using the hashtags Free Thames and Free Omale on Twitter. The Nigerian army says nearly 30 generals have tested positive for coronavirus after they attended a military conference. Testing was ordered after a major general died of COVID-19 days after the gathering in Abuja. Nigeria has seen a rise in infections in recent weeks, raising fears of a second wave. Right, let's get the sport now from Rob Schofield.
Thank you, Chloe. Tributes continue to be paid to the former Liverpool, Aston Villa and France manager Gérard Houllier, who's died at the age of 73. The Frenchman led Liverpool to 5 major trophies from 1998 to 2004. Former captain Steven Gerrard says he's absolutely devastated at the news. Goalkeeper Chris Kirkland also played under Houllier at Anfield.
I've always been a Liverpool fan, and then he made my dreams come true by signing me. He was a special man. It wasn't just about the football, it was about the human being as well. You could go and see him anytime. You just had this warm feeling about him that when you were talking to him, he made you feel $1 million, and he was a special man, and he's going to be really, really sadly missed.
Elsewhere, the last 16 draw for the Champions League has thrown out an incredible tie. Lionel Messi will face his old teammate Neymar as Barcelona take on Paris Saint-Germain. All the fixtures and those for the Europa League knockouts are on the BBC Sport website. The US Open Women's Golf will be completed this Monday after rain forced play to be suspended shortly after the start of Sunday's final round. Organisers had moved up the tee times because of the weather forecast in Houston, Texas, but thunderstorms closed in too soon to complete enough holes. And there are reports in America that the Cleveland Indians baseball team plan to change their name after decades of criticism. President Trump denounced the move, tweeting it was cancel culture at work. Opponents have long said the name that was first used in 1915 is racist and offensive to Native Americans.
Rob, thank you very much. Now let's head to Nigeria, where hundreds of schoolboys are still missing after gunmen kidnapped them from their boarding school in northern Nigeria on Friday night. Security forces say they've surrounded them in a forest area in northwestern Katsina state. Let's speak now to the BBC bilingual reporter in Abuja, Ishak Khalid. So, first of all, I know this is a confusing picture, Ishak, but what details do we have about what happened on Friday night?
Well, basically what we know so far is that gunmen in their numbers attacked the school overnight on Friday, shooting sporadically and also abducting a number of students there. It's a boys' school. So they were in their dormitories, but during the attack they scampered for safety. Some of them scaled the perimeter fence of the school. And there are more than 300 students that are still missing, according to the authorities. The school initially had about 800 students, but more than 300 have not been accounted for.
And is it clear if they are being held, or is it that maybe they managed to escape but haven't yet found their way back home?
Well, many of them initially returned to schools or to the school or their homes, and so at the moment, after a head count, 333 are still missing, and the authorities and also residents believe that they've been abducted. So the Nigerian military at the moment says that troops have surrounded the forest where they are thought to be held in captivity by the gunmen. The military spokesperson told the BBC that troops are there and they are also mounting surveillance checkpoints and are using other electronic equipment to locate these children and also rescue them without any harm. What the authorities are saying is that they are trying to avoid casualties in this rescue operation, but they are not giving details of what specifically, whether there are gun fire or exchange of fire with the militants. So far, no group has claimed responsibility, but the area is known to have a lot of security challenges, criminal gangs, attacking communities, kidnapping people for ransom, and also killing people in the northwest of Nigeria. Many people rule out the possibility of Boko Haram being behind this attack because Boko Haram operates hundreds of kilometers in the northeast away from the scene of the latest attack. So many people are blaming criminal gangs who have been operating in this particular state and other surrounding states for the past decade or so.
Have any of the children who managed to escape been able to talk about what happened and give a bit more information?
Yeah, the children and their parents are so distressed. Some of them who have managed to escape said that they scaled the fence that is during the abduction, and there is also another boy around 16 years old who escaped after the abduction. He told the BBC that when he escaped, he could not even find his way. He couldn't know. He didn't know which direction to take. He described his escape as miraculous, as a kind of miracle, the work of God. But he later found himself, of course, back home. The parents have been mounting pressure on the authorities as they continue to grieve the abductions, saying that the authorities should do more to rescue their kids. This is the latest in such attacks on schools, not only in the northwest of Nigeria, but across the northern state. In 2014, you remember the abduction of school girls in Chibok, which attracted a lot of international attention. Still around 100 of them are with Boko Haram militants. Also in 2018, more than 100 school girls were also abducted in another school in Yobe State. So many people are saying that a lot more has to be done to protect schools and to make learning environments safer for children as this insecurity continues. The United Nations has called on the Nigerian authorities to do more and also condemned the latest abduction, saying that this violates the rights of children to learn in a safe environment. So the authorities, on the other hand, say that they're still trying to rescue the children.
Well, Ishak, people in Nigeria have been getting in touch with us on WhatsApp throughout the course of the day. We had this message from a former student of the school where the attack took place.
My name is Abbas Yahya from Katsina, the state where this unfortunate incident happened. When I first heard about it, I was so heartbreaking because I have attended this school during my senior secondary school, and what came into my mind is how these school grade students from the great households being kidnapped. Because the school is so famous within science and technical both schools, so by that you can tell that we are about to lose a great minds due to incompetency of our governments and Nigeria in general. This government failed us woefully, especially in terms of security, as we all knew before this administration. Katsina was a peaceful state, and now every day is about insecurity issues. So honestly, we have even lost hope. Now, after several efforts in trying to draw their attentions, now only God is our hope. This government is deaf.
My name is Kabir Mukhtar. I'm truly indigenous of Katsina State. A few years back, Katsina was a peaceful state. Most of its populace rely heavily on farming. Unfortunately, recent days, bandits deprive our people access to their farm. There has been growing number of kidnappings in the state. Within these 3 days, hundreds of families in Katsina had sleepless nights. Some spent the night praying, while others spent the night crying. Some went out to search for their children. If you also look at the issue of Northeast, the situation is terribly. Few days back, there was a massacre in Zabarmari, Borno State. We are always making calls on government to renew its commitment to end insecurity in northern region and Nigeria at large. My thoughts and prayers are with the families of these poor children.
Well, thank you for those messages, and thank you also to our BBC bilingual reporter in Abuja, Ishak Khalid.
My name is Hashim.
Got a little flash there of another WhatsApp message which is coming from Nigeria, which we may well play a little later on in the programme. But for now, before we end this hour, let's go through some of the main stories on our tech pages today with our tech reporter Zoe Kleiman. Zoe, good to have you on. First, big headline in the gaming business about Electronic Arts and Codemasters. This means nothing to me. Please explain.
This is a story that's got a lot of people talking, actually. Codemasters is a British tech game maker. It's very beloved here in the UK. It was set up in the early 80s by two brothers who were schoolboys at the time, literally making games in their bedroom. And they became so popular they had to get their dad involved in order to sort of build this company because, you know, it was growing so rapidly. A lot of people feel very affectionate of it. It's become a very sort of big British institution, really. But it's up for sale. And we had reported just about a month ago, actually, that it was going to be bought by one of the US big games giants, a company called Take-Two Interactive. And they put together a bid that was worth $973 million, which is amazing, isn't it, for these two schoolboys who, you know, started out 30 odd years ago in their bedrooms. And then there's a phrase when people are buying a house, you know, we call it gazumping, when somebody leaps in and makes a higher offer at the last minute. Well, guess what? Take-Two has kind of been gazumped by Electronic Arts, EA, which is an even bigger games giant, also based in the US. And it has now swooped in and said it would like to buy the British game maker for a deal that's worth a $1.2 billion. So an even bigger amount of money than last time. And Codemasters has suggested to its shareholders that it should accept the Take-Two offer. And now it's kind of said, actually, do you know what? I think we should take the EA one. It's causing a lot of chatter. You know, there's this thing about sort of David and Goliath, and when big companies, big tech buy smaller firms, what do they tend to do with them? You know, they become part of this kind of big machine and they lose their sort of quirky individuality that they had before. But having said that, they also gain the deep pockets, frankly, and also the experience and knowledge of a much, much bigger company that might help them to push themselves up to another level. So a lot of excitement and intrepidation, I think, in the games world today about this bidding war that's broken out between these two enormous giants over this, you know, smaller British tech firm.
So if we had more time, we'd talk about the morality of gazumping there, but we don't, so we won't. Let's talk about the Google outage, which is really rare. What happened?
Yeah, this is an unusual one, actually. I mean, I can't remember reporting this before. Basically, for about 45 minutes today, if you had any Google services, and let's be honest, millions of us do, you know, if you're using Gmail or Google Drive or even YouTube, you may have found you were unable to access it. Now, the firm says this was due to a problem with its authentication system, which is basically a sort of tool that they use for people who are trying to log in. But it knocked everybody out, and it caused an awful lot of chatter on social media. A lot of businesses said they literally ground to a halt because everything they were using was you know, going through Google's cloud services, and suddenly they couldn't access them. I think it's a really timely reminder that if you are using any kind of cloud service, whether it's Google's Gmail or Amazon Web Services or anything else, essentially, you know, you are using somebody else's computer and you are absolutely relying on them to keep that service up to date. And of course, these things happen. It's sometimes outside of anybody's control, even Google. You know, when we first rang Google this morning to ask them what was going on, the person we spoke to said they couldn't access their email either. So
oh my word.
It was affected them too.
So it affected them too. Listen, Zoe, thank you ever so much for bringing us up to date on those stories. That's Zoe Kleiman, tech reporter here at the BBC World Service.
This is the BBC World Service, where Dr. Mark Carney delivers this year's Wreath Lectures.
Has the COVID-19 pandemic shifted our values?
Fundamental questions of the value of life versus the economy.
Dr. Mark Carney discusses how it has forced us to confront how we prioritise health, wealth and opportunity, and whether the importance of these values is changing.
The Wreath Lectures, Wednesday at 10 GMT. And in an hour, Outlook with Joe Fidgen.
Two men from different continents who've got a special bond with animals. An Irish vet who creates groundbreaking bionic limbs for injured pets, and a Costa Rican fisherman who formed an unlikely friendship with a wild crocodile.
Now we return to OS, here on the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Hello, this is OS Chloe Tilley with you today. Welcome to the programme. Now, this is the place where we speak to people directly affected by global breaking and developing stories. But we also break down important but complicated stories into a digestible form. And that brings us to the US Electoral College. You may well have heard the term a lot during the presidential election. Well, it's meeting right now and will officially declare Joe Biden as president-elect. It's largely procedural, but it's an important part of American democracy. And as we know, the US presidential election hasn't followed a normal path, and Donald Trump continues to refuse to accept the outcome. So all eyes are on those electoral college votes which are being cast. And once we have the result, will it then bring an end to the arguments of Mr. Trump and, of course, his supporters? It is complex, I'll give you that, but in 5 minutes we're going to guide you through it with the help of one of the reporters at the Wall Street Journal. So stay with us here on OS.
Hello, I'm Neil Nunes with the BBC News. The country worst hit by coronavirus, the United States, has kicked off its mass vaccination program. The first vaccination took place in New York, from where Netta Tawfik sent this report.
Shortly after 9 a.m. on Monday, an intensive care nurse at Long Island's Jewish Medical Center in Queens became the first person to be given the jab in the United States. Sarah Lindsay was applauded by those present. She said she felt hopeful and wanted to instill public confidence in the vaccine. Queens, New York, was the early epicenter of the country's outbreak. New York's Governor Andrew Cuomo said he believes this is the weapon that will end the war, which has killed nearly 300,000 Americans.
The British government is moving London to England's highest level of coronavirus restrictions, saying the rise in cases under the current rules threatens to overwhelm hospitals. From the start of Wednesday, the capital will close all catering outlets except for takeaway services. Any mixing between households will be limited to certain outdoor spaces, and cultural facilities must shut, but schools, shops and gyms will stay open. The Health Secretary Matt Hancock said a new variant of coronavirus has been identified in England. The investigative website Bellingcat has published new evidence implicating Russian intelligence agents in the poisoning of the opposition activist Alexei Navalny. Here's Steve Rosenberg.
Using phone and travel records, the investigation by Bellingcat and The Insider established that members of a secret FSB unit specializing in toxins and poisonous substances had been shadowing Alexei Navalny since 2017. They'd followed him on more than 30 trips, including to Siberia this year, where Russia's most prominent opposition figure had fallen critically ill. Alexei Navalny said it was now clear that the FSB had made several attempts on his life. The Kremlin critic accused the Russian authorities of state terrorism. He's convinced it was Vladimir Putin who gave the order to kill him. The Kremlin has previously denied any connection to the incident.
South Korea has banned the sending of anti-Pyongyang leaflets into North Korea, ending a propaganda exercise that's been taking place for decades. Here's Michael Bristow.
Activists would usually tie the leaflets to balloons and float them over the border for North Korean residents to find. South Korea's parliament has now put a stop to that and to the sending of money, goods and computer drives containing news and information. The Seoul government has itself previously engaged in its own cross-border activities, such as using loudspeakers to blast propaganda northwards. That's also been banned. The new law is being criticised for limiting free speech and pandering to North Korea's authoritarian leadership. Campaigners say they'll continue sending their leaflets.
World news from the BBC. The Saudi authorities say an explosion aboard an oil tanker in the port of Jeddah was the result of a terrorist attack. It was carried out using a boat packed with explosives. The owners of the Singapore-registered vessel said the blast had sparked a fire. There were no reports of casualties. The United States has for the first time accused Iran officially of direct involvement in the disappearance and presumed death of the former FBI agent Robert Levinson. The U.S. Treasury said that following new information, it was imposing sanctions on 2 officials in Iran's Interior Ministry who were implicated in Mr. Levinson's abduction. Robert Levinson disappeared in Iran 13 years ago. Police in Uganda say 2 Nigerian singers, Omali and Thames, have been arrested and charged after performing shows which were likely to spread coronavirus. Thames's manager and 4 Ugandans were also detained following the event in Kampala. 2 Russian football hooligans, whose assault on an England fan left him severely disabled, have been jailed in France. The attack took place during the European Championships in 2016. Hugh Schofield has this report.
The jury in the week-long trial was shown video from June 2016 in which a large group of Russians could be seen charging England fans near Marseille's Old Port. A French police officer who was at the scene said it was like a commando operation and that, unlike the England fans, the Russians were not drunk. Most of the England fans managed to flee, but Andrew Bash was too slow, and he could be seen in the video receiving a fierce blow to the back of the head from one of the 2 Russians in the dock and then crumpling to the ground. His life was saved by police, but he's now severely disabled and was unable to attend the trial. The 2 Russians were arrested in Germany 2 years ago as they travelled abroad for a match and extradited to France.
BBC World News.
Hello, welcome to OS on the BBC. Chloe Tilley live with you for the next hour. Now, there have been so many deadlines when it comes to the Brexit process. That's Britain exiting the European Union. You would be forgiven for losing track. It's something we've talked about quite often since the UK held a referendum on it 4 years ago and voted to part ways from their European neighbours. Yesterday was another deadline that came and went as the UK and EU tried to agree on a trade deal. We're told both sides are still far apart on some issues like fishing and access to European markets. But one deadline that can't move is the 31st of December. That is when a deal needs to be done. There's intensity of talking has significantly increased in recent days and in recent weeks. Now, if they end up parting without agreement, there's a warning about the cost on goods and businesses. This week on the show, we plan to return to some of those we've spoken to over the past 4 years about Brexit. And in around 10 minutes, we're going to play you a conversation I had with one Briton who voted for Brexit. Now he wants compromise to achieve a deal. So you'll hear more from him shortly. But let's start in the US, where the first people have started to be vaccinated by the Pfizer-BioNTech coronavirus jab. Every weekday, we speak to a coronavirus expert, and today that was Dr. Eleanor Murray. She is the Assistant Professor of Epidemiology at Boston University School of Public Health. However, first, I want to play you a clip of Monsef Slaoui, who is the Chief Scientific Advisor to the US vaccination plan known as Operation Warp Speed. He told the BBC the aim was to vaccinate over 100 million people within the next few months.
The very first vaccine doses will be inoculated primarily to very old, frail people that are in long-term care facilities, as well as to the healthcare workers that are in the front line. And after that, we're targeting healthcare workers, first-line workers, and people over the age of 65. That's about 120 million people overall. And our plans is to be able to have vaccinated this population by the end of the month of March.
Dr. Murray, this is a huge logistical challenge, isn't it? Vaccinating such a vast number of people.
Yeah, definitely the logistics of this are really challenging. But I think this is something that public health and emergency response officials have thought about for a long time. Organizations like FEMA and the CDC will have had plans in place for this kind of thing. And so I think, it's not something that's infeasible. I think things that we're going to want to watch out for is, how do we tell people that their time in the queue has arrived? How do we assure them that it's the right time for them to take the vaccine and that they should be confident with it? I think the other thing to remember is that 120 million people is a huge number of people, but that's, somewhere between a quarter and a third of the US population. And, what we've seen from some of the vaccine modeling studies is that we may need up to 70% of the population vaccinated before COVID stops really circulating. And so I think the other thing we'll need to encourage people, have a conversation with, we still need to be wearing masks, we still need to be washing our hands, even as these 120 million doses people get vaccinated, because it will protect those people for sure, but it's not enough to protect the people who aren't yet vaccinated.
That was Dr. Eleanor Murray, Assistant Professor of Epidemiology at Boston University School of Public Health. And she does come and join us every Monday here on OS. Tomorrow we'll have another expert on COVID-19 to answer your questions and take us through the latest news lines on the global pandemic. Now, staying in the US, you may well have seen the hashtag Electoral College trending on various social medias, and you might remember that phrase from the US election. Well, the US presidential election was, of course, 5 weeks ago, and you'd be right in thinking that President-elect Joe Biden is set to become president in January after getting 7 million more votes than Donald Trump. Mr. Biden also won 306 votes to Mr. Trump's 232 in the Electoral College. Well, incumbent US President Trump continues to make unsubstantiated claims of voter fraud and has been fighting the result in numerous court cases, which have come to nothing. But the reason Electoral College is trending is that the votes that officially anoint the next president are actually being cast right now. You might be understandably confused. Don't worry, many of us are. I spoke to Natalie Andrews, Congress reporter for the Wall Street Journal, and asked her to explain how it all works.
I often tell people to not think of the election as a national election, but to think of it as 50 states, 50 separate elections. So each state gets a number of electoral college votes. It's based on population and size, and it takes 270 of those to win. And so that is one reason why when we follow the U.S. election on election night, we're looking at some of these key states that can swing either way and that are populous enough to bring in quite a few electoral college votes, which is why Georgia and Pennsylvania were able to put Joe Biden over the edge. It takes 270 votes to win. And today, these electors from each state will formally meet. And this is usually a formality. It usually doesn't get much attention, but because of the unsubstantiated claims that Donald Trump has been making and the pressure that he's put on these local Republicans, it is something that we're watching. Usually these electors go right along with however their state voted, and they select that, they cast their votes formally, and then it gets sent to Congress.
Now, you say normally, and I guess that's the really important thing, isn't it? Because they don't have to.
Yeah, they don't have to. We don't expect shenanigans today, although I never say never, especially in 2020. But this is something that we're watching. It's more of a formality. It's something that is getting more attention this year because everything has been getting more attention this year as we watch the presidential election. And it is kind of one of those steps where several Republican lawmakers have not declared Joe Biden the president-elect or not talked as though he was the president-elect. And some of them have pointed to today as, okay, well, once the Electoral College votes, then I will acknowledge that Joe Biden is the president-elect. So it could mean a shift with members of Congress where they start acknowledging that Joe Biden is the president-elect. And that is one thing we're watching closely.
And could it be the day that President Trump acknowledges President-elect Joe Biden?
We've seen a few indicators that he knows that his time may be coming to an end in the White House, and he's at times referenced even saying, like the next administration or things like that, but he's still continuing to dispute the election results.
How damaging is that to the whole process and indeed going forward? If Joe Biden goes into the White House in January with Donald Trump still saying there was widespread voter fraud, what does that do for the democratic process in the US?
Well, certainly it's important that elections are trusted. And anytime someone casts a doubt on the electoral process, especially someone from a high position of authority, who has a large following, it can lead to conflict. There were protests in Washington over the weekend. There are going to be people who doubt the election results because Donald Trump has raised these questions. So it does cast doubts among voters, and that is not good for the electoral process. It remains to be seen how long he keeps up his protest and how long Republicans back him. And I think if that continues, that's on the long term, that's much more damaging than if it's a short-term thing.
We said that you're the Congress reporter, and you were talking about the fact that Republicans in Congress could now start to accept that Biden has won the presidency after these votes today in the Electoral College. Does it matter? I mean, are they influential enough that they could get Donald Trump to say, OK, yeah, I lost? I mean, is it particular ones we're looking at, particular people, or are we talking about numbers here?
Well, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has not, to our knowledge, reached out to Joe Biden. He has been very careful in his wording. He has at times talked about the incoming administration, but he has not talked to Joe Biden. He has not discussed Joe Biden as coming in as the next president. And if you do see prominent Republicans making those steps, it does help in the transition. Kevin McCarthy signed on to a letter that was sent to the Supreme Court disputing the election results. He's the minority leader in the House. These Republicans casting doubts on the election or not wanting to talk about the election results in a definitive way, it does cast a shadow over things that are happening.
And finally, before I let you go, how long does it take for this process to happen of the Electoral College votes being cast today?
Each state will have their own process, and because of the pandemic, some of these things may take a little bit longer. But Vermont and Indiana have already started, but Hawaii is going to start several hours from now. So it will take really all day and into the night to finalize it.
And that was Natalie Andrews, Congress reporter for the Wall Street Journal. This is OS on the BBC with me, Chloe Tilley. To Pakistan, where a murder suspect has been shot dead as he attended a court hearing in the city of Karachi. He was reportedly shot at close range by the father of the man he was accused of murdering 4 years ago. He's now been arrested. In Malaysia, opposition MPs walked out of Parliament in protest after 3 politicians who were supposed to be quarantining were allowed to turn up for a vote. They wore full protective clothing and were taken there in an ambulance. It caused outrage, and pictures of the 3 have been shared on social media. And Japan Airlines is encouraging passengers to skip in-flight meals in order to reduce waste. The so-called ethical choice option is available on overnight flights where many passengers are asleep anyway. Now, with the exception of coronavirus, of course, Brexit, which is Britain leaving the European Union, dominates politics here in the UK. The talking about what happens when Britain does finally go it alone has been going on for more than 4 years, since the UK voted in favour of it. But those talks about a trade deal between the two sides is really coming to a head with a deadline at the end of this month. Just over a year ago, we spoke to voters in the UK's general election. One place we went to was Cheltenham, a town in the west of England. Boris Johnson won the election, of course, with his promise of getting Brexit done. On OS, we're catching up with some of those voters we've spoken to previously. Now, Dimitri voted for Brexit, and a little bit earlier on, he told me what led him to this decision.
Well, the way I voted, I was stood in that ballot box and I looked down, do you stay in the EU or do you leave the EU? And I could not endorse the EU, so I put my cross in the leave box. Contrary to what my wife did, she wanted to stay in the EU, but it was a decision I made that I could not endorse the European Union.
Did that lead to a difficult home life for a few months?
No, it didn't. We always knew how we would vote. It was not an issue at all. It might be more of an issue going into the future if things don't pan out well and we're having to pay more. And she keeps on saying things like, well, that's your fault.
None of us knew, did we, 4 years ago, what a Brexit would look like, what a Brexit deal might look like. So many of us have learnt so much on this journey, if you like. But has it panned out at all how you expected?
Yes and no. It's a lot more protracted than I ever thought. I really had no ideas. When you think it was 4.5 years ago, when the vote was, and then all the campaigning was even longer, the way it's turned out is probably similar to what I would have expected, because I never expected it to be as easy as was promised. That was not something I ever believed when people were saying that it would be the easiest deal to make with the European Union, because they were never going to make it easy for Britain to leave, because why would they? They kind of have to cut their nose off to spite their face to make sure that no one else does something like what we in Britain have done.
I know that you run your own business, don't you? And I know that your wife also works.
Yeah.
How do you think you could be directly impacted, your life, by a potential no deal?
My wife, who, as I say, she wanted to remain, the major impact on her would be her job. Her work life would probably change. It did around the election. She had to do sort of a lot more hours at that time. She works in financial services. That's all sort of calmed down now. Financially, in the wage packet, I think she's been told that there wouldn't be that much money to sort of pay in bonuses or anything like that. Not that she's on a big amount of money or anything like that. In terms of ourselves, our home life, then one of the things we read is that food prices could go up 25%, and that would have a massive impact on us. We would struggle if that was an ongoing thing. If you look at your monthly shop bill, and let's say for argument's sakes, that's £500. If that's going up to £600, that's a major thing for us. So that would have an impact.
What do you think Boris Johnson and the people who are leading the negotiations at the moment should be doing? Do you think that the British government should be giving in a little to the EU to avoid exactly what you've just said, to try and get a deal?
Yeah, I totally do. There was so much puffing the chest out when the campaigning was going on. Oh, we're going to be able to get such a good deal because we're such a big purchasing power in the European Union. That was a really silly stance to take, and as I say, I'm someone who voted to leave. But the problem with that is, for instance, if you're going to buy a house and you're walking around and the other people who own the house are there and you're walking around trying to gloat and saying, oh, I'm going to get such a good deal buying this house, I'm going to get so much money off, you're going to get the other side sort of digging their heels in. And I think now's the time has come really to actually start conceding, and I think that will happen. I think it was always going to be going right up to the wire, right up to the deadline, to see who blinks first.
Well, that was Dimitri, and we thank him for speaking to us again on OS. He was a Brexit voter. He voted for Britain to exit the European Union 4.5 years ago in that referendum. Well, let's bring in now our UK political correspondent, Rob Watson, who really is watching every twist and turn of this Brexit story. Rob, good to speak to you again.
You too, Chloe.
I mean, where are we now? We've had so many deadlines come and go. We're all losing track of where we're at and what they're disagreeing over.
It was fascinating listening to Dimitri, wasn't it? Well, we'll come back to that in a second, no doubt, because really interestingly, despite everything that's happened, the opinion polls suggest that not many Leave voters have changed their minds. Not very many Remain voters have changed their minds. But where are we? As you pointed out right at the start, this transition period is supposed to end it will end on 31st of December, and then there will need to be, or maybe there will be, a new arrangement between the European Union and the UK. And so far, it's proved immensely tricky to get an agreement. It's sort of been off again, on again. It looked very dramatic last week. Now they're still talking. If you were going to ask me, will they reach an agreement on what the UK and the EU's future relationship would be, I would have to just say, hand on heart, that until there's definitively no deal or a deal, both are possible.
Let's talk about what Dimitri was saying, because it was really interesting, wasn't it? As someone who was backing Britain leaving the European Union, but very much wanting that compromise, wanting a trade deal to be done now, because he and many other people will be hit in the pocket potentially if there is a no deal.
Yeah, two interesting points, Chloe. I think an awful lot of people on the Remain side, and it was almost a 50-50 split, as you know, 48-52. An awful lot of Remainers in this country think, haven't Brexiteers got it yet? Either the politicians or the people that voted leave, that this is utterly crazy and is never going to work. And there's been very little evidence of that. But the second point I was going to make is that during the referendum in 2016, and Dimitri, I think, was talking about this, the Leave side, the Vote Leave side, which of course was led by guess who, the man who is now our Prime Minister, never said that there would be, always suggested that it would be easy to get a deal, or certainly that there would be a deal, and that was a promise that the Prime Minister made again in the election campaign last December, a year ago. So I think what all of this suggests is, have Brexiteers turned against Brexit? No, they haven't. Does the Prime Minister need to be a bit careful, though, about the likely fallout, the complications, any food shortages on the shelf, inconveniences, job losses, if there was a no-deal Brexit? Then I think he does, and I suspect that is probably why he's still talking to the European Union.
Just explain why there could potentially be food shortages or big hikes in food prices with a no deal.
One word: tariffs. So basically, as things stand, there are no barriers in trade between the UK and the European Union. So it's just as easy as trading from, I don't know, between London and Liverpool as between London and Paris. What will happen if there's no deal is that you just revert to these automatic international tariffs. And to give you some, for example, says Rob, frantically scrambling in his little book. So I haven't got them to hand, but I mean, it's something like, someone's going to call it and correct me, but there are huge tariffs on things like beef and lamb exports out to the European Union. But back in this way as well, there are fairly large tariffs on things like cars. There are tariffs on goods, and perhaps the best way to think about it is that one of the biggest supermarkets in this country, I better not name it, not allowed to advertise, they reckon there would be something like an on average 5-ish% rise in your shopping basket. And if you're a family that has to watch your money, 5 to 6% on the family shopping, you'd really notice.
And lots of people are during the COVID pandemic. People are losing their jobs or furloughed. It's kind of the worst time when people seem to have less money for this to happen.
Absolutely. And I should have added something else really, really dumb of me. I'll do it briefly. So 30% of the UK's food comes from the European Union. And on the main crossing between the UK and the EU, it's between Dover and Calais, you get something like 10,000 lorries a day, trucks a day. And of course, if there's a no-deal Brexit, there'll be tons and tons of paperwork. There will be with a deal anyway, customs checks. So you could see there's a sort of fear that vehicles just wouldn't be able to get into the country.
And of course, we've talked about these deadlines coming and going, but the real deadline is the 31st of December. And so presumably they could talk up pretty much to that date.
Sorry, you've reminded me, Chloe, I'm such a bad person that was your original question. Where are we? I'm going to have to hit myself or make notes. What a fool. Sorry, I was about to say it's been a long day, but it's been a long 4.5 years covering this.
Indeed.
So, all the way we've talked about this, I think they were supposed to try and get an agreement by October. And diplomats and officials say, we're going to take this up to the wire. There's a line in the sand. We're coming to that line in the sand. Look, with the line in the sand, we're out of the desert. We've been across so many lines. And as to going down to the wire, we're below the wire and looking up at it. So you're absolutely right. The absolute cutoff is the 31st of December, because that is when the transition comes to an end. And that is it, ladies and gentlemen. It would be done. So I suppose, would one rule out a deal any time between now and then? No.
And the reality is, the mood music on both sides, the language is slightly sounding a little bit more positive. And if there's one thing we know about Boris Johnson, he likes to deliver good news. He's going to want to come forward and say, hey, I've got a deal.
Well, two things there. So I'll do the good news bit first. You're right, but the reason why Mr. Johnson isn't just rushing to do a deal is because it's a complicated choice for him. Because if there is a deal, there are many in his governing Conservative Party, sort of Brexit hardliners, true believers, who any form of compromise with the EU will be sell out, betrayal to Brussels, and that, of course, was what did for Theresa May. So he's quite mindful of that. Second one, on the mood music, I've long given up trying to figure out, whether things are up or down. So, we'll wait and see what happens, yeah?
Rob, good advice. We'll speak to you again. We know we will. That's our UK political correspondent, Rob Watson, who is wearily watching every twist and turn in those Brexit negotiations. You're listening to OS on the BBC World Service. Don't go anywhere. We're live for the next 30 minutes.
This is the BBC World Service. What can a body reveal about a person's life?
Deafness,
inflammatory bowel disease,
heart rhythm disturbance,
manic depressive disorder,
fevers and
Usable pieces of music.
Just the thought that someone in his state could write anything.
When he died in 1827, his autopsy revealed he was suffering from numerous ailments.
You look at the score closely, it starts off with heavy of heart, but that could also be a sensation of squeezing of the chest, a chest tightness.
I'm Georgia Mann. I'm exploring how Beethoven's illnesses translated into his work.
As a result of the deafness, the things have to be larger than life.
How his physical and mental health became a part of his music.
Dissecting Beethoven. Sunday at 14 GMT.
Hello, this is Chloe Tilley on BBC OS. Welcome to the programme. We're continuing our conversations with frontline health workers around the world by heading to Brazil shortly to hear from a doctor treating COVID patients. In a country where the president has dismissed the virus as a little flu, we'll look at the impact his actions have had on health services there and examine the criticism of his failure to prepare a nationwide COVID vaccination programme. That discussion for you later this half hour.
BBC News with Neil Nunes. The United States has begun its mass coronavirus vaccination campaign with an intensive care nurse in New York, the first to receive the injection. Nearly 3 million doses of the Pfizer-Moderna vaccine are being distributed across the country. The pandemic has killed nearly 300,000 Americans. The British government is moving London to England's highest level of coronavirus restrictions, saying the rise in cases could overwhelm hospitals. The Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, also told Parliament a new variant of coronavirus has been identified in England. In Germany, officials have warned against a shopping frenzy before non-essential stores close on Wednesday. The European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has highlighted movement in the post-Brexit talks, calling it good, but she said the final mile was the essential one. British officials have reverted to the Prime Minister Boris Johnson's prognosis that no deal was the most likely outcome. The investigative website Bellingcat says it has evidence that the Russian opposition activist Alexei Navalny was poisoned by an undercover Russian intelligence hit squad. It alleges an FSB team followed him on 30 trips, including to Siberia, where he fell into a coma in August after being given the nerve agent Novichok. The Kremlin has rubbished all accusations. South Korea has banned the sending of anti-Pyongyang leaflets into North Korea, ending an exercise that's gone on for decades. Activists tie leaflets to balloons and float them over the border. The new law has been criticized by human rights organizations. Heavy rain and fog have dampened the hopes of Chileans trying to see a total solar eclipse. Several 100,000 tourists joined residents in the central region of Araucanía, but were frustrated by the conditions. It's Chile's second solar eclipse in 18 months. BBC News.
Hello, welcome to OS on the BBC World Service with Chloe Tilley. Thanks for your company. Now, we talk about COVID-19 each day here on the show. We bring people together to share their experiences and we explain developments with the pandemic. Well, as we watch the first vaccines being given in the United States, the worst affected country globally, we'll spend some time hearing from countries where there is perhaps concern that they don't have the same amount of spending power and they fear being towards the back of the queue. Our population reporter, Steph Hegarty, has been hearing from people around the world, and we'll talk to her in just over 10 minutes' time here on OS. Now, in the US today, state electors will gather in person at state capitals across the US. They'll cast their electoral college votes, which will formalise President-elect Joe Biden's win. But what is the Electoral College? You may have thought that voters in the US had already made their choice, but it's members of the Electoral College who meet today to pick the next president. Confused? Well, here's an explanation from the BBC's Reality Check.
You may think the U.S. election is over and Joe Biden has secured the presidency with 80 million votes. But there's still a significant step to go on December 14th, and it all comes down to how the U.S. president is actually elected. When Americans went to the polls, they weren't technically voting for Donald Trump or Joe Biden, but for members of something called the Electoral College. The word college simply refers to a group of people, or electors, with a shared task to choose the President of the United States. The system goes back more than 200 years. The founders of the United States wanted to establish a democratic system, but were concerned that a direct popular vote might lead to the election of an unsuitable president. Electors were settled on as a compromise. Each state was given a number of electors based roughly on the size of its population. Today, there are 538 electors, and the successful presidential candidate will need to get a majority of these, at least 270, in order to win. In most states, the candidate who wins the popular vote gets the support of all of that state's electors. For example, whether a winning candidate gets 99 or 51% of the vote in California, they would still receive all the state's 55 electoral college votes. That's why it's possible for a candidate to lose the popular vote across the country, but still secure a majority of electoral college votes and become president. That's what happened in 2016, when Trump secured the presidency despite getting almost 3 million fewer votes than his election rival. 2 out of the last 6 elections were won by candidates who had fewer votes than their rivals, although this hadn't happened for more than 100 years before the 2000 election. What all this means is that campaigns often focus on strategies that help secure the 270 electoral votes needed to win. They tend to target battleground or swing states, rather than trying to turn out voters in states which consistently vote for the same party. In fact, in the 2020 presidential election, 12 battleground states saw 96% of campaign events. 33 states saw no events at all. So, the 538 members of the Electoral College play a crucial role in how the President of the United States is elected. Over the years, there have been efforts to change the Electoral College system, but proponents say it helps deliver decisive results across a vast country, and everyone knows the rules of the game before Election Day.
So an explainer there of the Electoral College system by BBC Reality Check. And we've been getting reaction to today's Electoral College vote from supporters of Donald Trump that we've spoken to previously on OS. Let's listen to a couple of messages we've received.
This is Melanie in Georgia. It's interesting because the electors are a group of people who are designated to cast their ballot to represent the wishes of each respective state. The problem we've got this year is that we've got several states that are in question. There have been allegations and evidence of wrongdoing during the election process in these states, and therefore we are not clear on what the wishes of those states actually are. Therefore, today will be a meeting. The electors will gather. They will cast their ballots based on what they know as of today. However, today is the 14th of December, and our president is not sworn in until January the 20th. That is a constitutional date, and that will be the date I am focused on. I don't want to say I'll dismiss today, but I have to consider the fact that it is almost impossible for the electors to do their job under the current conditions. So with that said, I will look forward to January the 20th, and I will pray that the person that is sworn in on that date is the person who the American people have chosen as their next president.
This is Kirsten LeBlanc sending a message from beautiful Sandpoint, Idaho. I am a proponent of the U.S. Electoral College. The Electoral College is the best method for ensuring that the voices of Americans who don't have money or incredible power are heard. The one thing the Electoral College cannot do is ensure that cities run by corrupt officials play by the rules. If Democrats were so certain Biden won without fraud, they should have demanded a complete and thorough investigation. I am so encouraged that approximately 10 million more Americans voted for Trump in 2020 than in 2016. I am grateful they recognized our country is worth defending. I am hopeful individual Americans will prevail against the rich and powerful, and that our Electoral College will lead the way. Thank you, and have a wonderful day.
Well, thank you to Kirsten and to Melanie. Now, they both referred there to claims of voter fraud made by Donald Trump and some Republicans, but there has been no evidence of this, and Mr. Trump's lawyers have failed to provide any. US Attorney General William Barr says his Justice Department has found no proof to back claims of fraud. He said, to date, we have not seen fraud on a scale that could have affected a different outcome in this election. Now, as the coronavirus vaccine begins to roll out across the UK and the US, many other countries are reflecting on when they'll start to see a vaccine, amid claims that just a handful of wealthy countries will dominate the world's supply. Well, the BBC's population correspondent Stephanie Hegarty joins us now. So, Steph, what are the concerns of the people that you've spoken to?
Well, I've spoken to various different people at different sides of this argument, and on one side, there's the People's Vaccine Campaign, who we heard about last week. They came out accusing rich countries of hoarding the COVID vaccines. And they looked at data collected by Duke University, which showed that a handful of countries had bought a lot more doses than their population actually needs. And one of the women who's involved in that campaign, Lois Chingandu, she's works in HIV prevention in Zimbabwe. And she was saying that she sees parallels to the late 90s when this life-saving medication was available to treat HIV, but it was only available in rich countries or to very wealthy people. And she was seeing thousands of people dying in Zimbabwe, even though this was available. And Lois is worried that the same thing is happening again.
We see ourselves as really at the back of the queue. Because of the country where I'm sitting, I have no idea when I will get a vaccine for COVID. If I get infected today, I might even die from COVID. Eventually, when the privileged do decide that it's time to save the poor people, that's when we are going to get the vaccine.
So give us an idea of what these countries are doing to try and get hold of this vaccine.
Well, for countries like Zimbabwe, there is one very far-reaching initiative that could help them. It's called COVAX, and it's backed by the WHO and several other international public health groups. COVAX now has 190 countries involved. South Africa just joined up today, officially becoming the 190th. And it works two ways. If you're a low-income country, you can have your vaccines paid for by COVAX. There's a fund set up that's sponsored by donors. And the UK, for example, has donated $500 million to that fund. Then if you're a low to middle income country or a wealthier country, you can sign up to COVAX, but you can pay for your vaccines. The idea is, especially if you're a smaller country, that you might get a better deal if you're signed up to COVAX because it's negotiating as a bloc. You could get a better deal than you did if you tried to negotiate directly. But then often that's not enough. COVAX in 2021 at least will only cover up to 20% of the population of a country. So there's a lot of countries that are involved in it, say Mexico, for example, or Pakistan, both of whom negotiators I spoke to. They're not just looking to COVAX to secure vaccines, but they're also working on bilateral deals. So they're talking directly to all of the lead candidates, the vaccine companies that are producing promising vaccines at the moment. And Martha Delgado is one of Mexico's head vaccine negotiators.
We understand that the countries which are really developing the vaccines want to serve their own communities first. But yes, sometimes it is frustrating to not get the amount that we really need. I know that there are countries that have pre-purchased doses enough for 7 or 8 or 10 times the inhabitants that they have, and we cannot do that.
So we've got politics going on here. There's kind of like a sort of a diplomacy role that's going on in trying to get a slice of the vaccine pie, if you like.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Martha Delgado did say that she admitted that Mexico's good diplomatic relations with various countries that are producing these vaccines, she says, did help them to get a heads up about what might be ready soon, and then allowed them to get involved in negotiations early. And she has secured access to the Pfizer vaccine as well as 2 others. So Mexico is one of the handful of countries that is actually going to start vaccinating this year. But I spoke to also Dr. Faisal Sultan, who's special assistant to the Prime Minister in Pakistan. And he, although he's been working very hard and says negotiations are going well, hasn't secured any doses yet. They will hopefully be getting doses through COVAX. But he was saying that there is diplomacy involved. They're trying to stay above the fray at the moment, although that, in his words, that might not always be possible. And then there's other things happening as well. Like, for example, Pakistan is working with China to run trials of the Chinese vaccine company, CanSino Bio, is running trials of its vaccine in Pakistan. And although that it's not a quid pro quo, those agreements definitely help countries to negotiate access to these vaccines when they're ready.
Stephanie Hegarty, thank you very much. She's the BBC's population correspondent. Now, let me just bring you this bit of advice, which we have received from the BBC's health and science correspondent, James Gallagher, who speaks to us often here on OS. This is after Britain's health secretary spoke in the House of Commons about an hour or so ago about a new variant of COVID-19 that may be associated with the faster spread of the virus in a part of England, including London. Now, James says viruses mutate all of the time. He adds that the health secretary said may be associated with the faster spread, and that's not the same as saying it's causing the rise. He also says that new strains can become more common for reasons that have nothing to do with the virus. And he also says, importantly, at the moment, there are scary headlines everywhere, but still no scientific detail to know how significant this is. So really, it's a kind of, well, we're learning all the time, aren't we, with COVID-19 and the global pandemic, and it's kind of a watch to see how that story progresses. Chloe Tilley with you on OS from the BBC World Service. Let's take a look at some of the stories being worked on by my colleagues. A British Iranian academic has been sentenced to 8 years in prison by a court in Tehran. Kamil Ahmadi was convicted of collaborating with a hostile government. The British government is urgently seeking more information. After years of protests from fans and Native American groups, the Cleveland Indians have decided to change their name, moving away from a moniker that has long been criticised as racist. And singer Jessie Nelson has officially quit the band Little Mix. Posting on Instagram, she said being in the band had taken a toll on her mental health. The news comes a month after she took an extended break from the pop group for private medical reasons. Now on OS, we continue to look at how the coronavirus pandemic is affecting people's lives all around the world. We often hear from frontline healthcare workers who deal with traumatic events on a daily basis whilst treating COVID patients. Well, today we head to Brazil, where the politics and President Bolsonaro's handling of the outbreak have complicated things. More than 181,000 Brazilians have died from the COVID-19. But in the past, the president has dismissed the severity of the disease, even calling it a little flu. Mr. Bolsonaro is also facing criticism over his failure to prepare a nationwide COVID vaccination programme. Well, we're going to hear from our reporter in Brazil in a moment. But first, let's hear from Dr. Gerson Salvador, an infectious disease specialist at the University Hospital of Sao Paulo in Brazil. He's been telling my colleague Ben James about the risks of coronavirus to himself and to his colleagues.
Last week, a friend of mine, 35 years guy, doctor, passed away with COVID-19. Unfortunately, he is not the only friend that I have lost. In Brazil, we have one of the worst scenarios around the world. And doctors, nurses, and healthcare professionals are one of the most vulnerable. Unfortunately, my friend passed away.
At 35 years old, had you spoken about the risk to yourselves?
Yeah, nowadays we have the personal protective equipment. We had problems with PPE in the beginning of the pandemic. It was a problem worldwide. But we have uncontrolled situation in Brazil. In our best moment, we had about 300 deaths a day. So the figures are climbing up just now, but we don't have a second wave. We just have a kind of tsunami epidemic.
What does that mean for your work every day?
And in our work, we face very severe people, and we have more deaths between our black people. Almost 60% of our people are Afro-Brazilians, okay? And in our black population, we have the worst figures, as well as United States of America. And our situation is worse in our poor people. Unfortunately, almost 20% of Brazilian people live in very bad conditions. And in this population, the pandemic never has been controlled. Now, we have seen the figures worsening. Also, in our private hospitals, it's difficult have intensive care beds for every people who needs it.
So you're running out of beds in intensive care?
Yeah.
Why would you say things are getting so bad?
It's a disaster, and the main culprit is President Bolsonaro, because we don't have a national organized response. Our minister is not a doctor or even a healthcare professional, it's a general, and the government don't have a coordinated response with the states and local governments. Our president minimized the situation and make jokes in social network about our problems. Unfortunately, Bolsonaro, as well Trump, they are responsible.
And we've heard lots of debates on this programme involving people who may support President Bolsonaro, may support President Trump, and we won't go over all of those debates right now, but suffice it to say, some point to the economy and say, well, we need to safeguard that. And of course, healthcare professionals like yourself would likely disagree with that interpretation. But on the subject of the national government in Brazil and the state governments, there's an interesting contrast, isn't there, in your state of São Paulo on the idea of the vaccine that is to come, because President Bolsonaro disagrees with your own state governor that a vaccine, in the governor's view, in São Paulo, should be compulsory. What do you think about that?
From my point of view, this is not an individual choice. Immunization is a public choice because the immunization is not only about the people who receives the vaccine, but to protect the entire society, okay? So we need a deal around the country about the vaccines. We don't have to elect one of the vaccines. We have different good products, and we need to use them in a coordinated response to immunize our population in general.
So if somebody says, I do not want a vaccine in São Paulo, what do you think should happen to them? Should they be punished?
Yeah, the Brazilian law supports administrative punishment for people that does not take vaccines, but I essentially don't know how it could be managed in our situation where the federal government is in a kind of political war against the São Paulo government.
I understand. So that conflict between your local government and the national government would make it difficult to enforce that, even if the governor wanted it to happen.
Yeah, unfortunately, in the fight between our president and the governor of São Paulo, the winner is the coronavirus.
Which is so sad, whichever politics you have, if it means that more people are going to become ill and die. Do you think, though, that enough people will choose to have a vaccine when one becomes available? I have seen some research that suggests there are increasing levels of vaccine skepticism in Brazil, just as there are in some other parts of the world.
I think that people will take the vaccine as soon as it would be available. And I hope so that the propaganda from the President Bolsonaro does not impact our figures on immunization. And I hope so that our civil society, our scientific community, and even the international society can help us to fight against the fake news that unfortunately came from our president in Brazil.
How are you feeling, Doctor, after so many months of this, nearly a year of this, I suppose? You've lost friends, the work is long and hard. How does it leave you feeling?
Sometimes we feel tired, sometimes we feel sad. In the last 9 months, I've not seen my nephews, my sisters. It's not easy for us, but we have to be part of solution.
And that was Dr. Herson Salvador, an infectious disease specialist at the University Hospital of Sao Paulo in Brazil, speaking a little bit earlier on to my colleague Ben James. And we will continue here on OS to speak to frontline healthcare workers each day on the programme. Well, I also spoke to the BBC Brazil's Camila Mota from Sao Paulo, who told me the politics behind vaccination in Brazil.
Bolsonaro has been heavily criticized for not showing a consistent vaccination plan, and he had been attacking the governor of the state of São Paulo, João Dória, for reaching out to the Chinese and negotiating directly with them 46 million doses of the Coronavac. Dória, as we know, actually wants to run for president against Bolsonaro in 2 years, so vaccination in Brazil became sort of a political battlefield. The two of them kept clashing over the subject, and meanwhile, Bolsonaro was being more and more pressured as other countries are already starting to vaccinate to actually lay out a plan. So over the weekend, he presented what was supposed to be a vaccination program, but was completely filled with gaps. So that you guys have an idea, it covers only 25% of the Brazilian population, around 50 million people, and doesn't have a detailed schedule or logistics to provide raw materials for needles, syringes, etc. It doesn't even say when vaccination is supposed to start. So the current situation is the Supreme Court gave the government 48 hours to clarify these and other information. So we're waiting here anxiously.
And how do people respond to that lack of direction from their president?
Brazilians in general are very frustrated. Bolsonaro, as Dr. Gerson was pointing out, he's been downplaying the severity of the pandemic since its beginning. Of course, Bolsonaro counts with this small but really loud group of supporters, around 15% of the constituents. But truth is, the majority of the Brazilians are tired of the pandemic and really frustrated with the president.
Now, after what looked like a few months where things might be starting to get under control, there has been a rise in the number of cases, hasn't there? Is it clear why that is?
Chloe, the situation never got too comfortable here in Brazil, but after this really surge in the infection curve, we were living kind of in a plateau. The situation, the infection curve started what seemed to be a decreasing trend. But what we see now that was not the case, and worse, most Brazilians simply gave up social distancing. Many resumed their lives. So there's mounting concern that numbers could actually spike after Christmas and New Year. And as Dr. Gerson was saying, we're already seeing in some states hospital capacity get close to its limit once again, something that we saw happening 6 months ago. So the whole outlook here is quite worrying.
And that was BBC Brazil's Camila Mota speaking to me a little bit earlier on from Sao Paulo. Now, as we've been covering here on OS, the formal process to certify Joe Biden's US presidential election victory is underway as the 538 members of the US Electoral College publicly cast their ballots for the presidency. Each state's electors are meeting at a selected time and place or virtually. Vermont's 3 Democratic electors were the first to vote. The Republican states of Indiana, Mississippi and Tennessee followed. In Georgia, Stacey Abrams, who stood to be governor, announced the result of the state's electors' vote.
I am pleased to announce that Joseph R. Biden has received 16 votes for President of the United States.
And so is the formal process of appointing Joe Biden as the next president of the United States. Of course, he will take office in January. Thanks for your company on today's edition of OS. We're back at the same time again tomorrow.
This is the BBC World Service, where the story of the anti-government protests in Belarus continues.
For over 100 days, Alexander Lukashenko has faced mass demonstrations against his 26-year rule. These are the stories of the protesters who no longer recognize him as their president.
Every time we go out to protest, we are really afraid.
Belarus across the barricades at bbcworldservice.com/documentaries. And at 1850 GMT, it's Witness History.
The American entertainer Bing Crosby made White Christmas by Irving Berlin one of the defining songs of war.
Coming up on Outlook in a few minutes' time, Noel Fitzpatrick, the Irish vet who fits injured animals with bionic limbs, like Oscar the cat, who lost 2 of his paws to a combine harvester.
We can see that his new foot is like a blade. It hits the ground like a normal foot and has a little sole on it so he can get some traction and works like a seesaw.
Noel's famous in the UK and Ireland, where he's known as the super vet. His dreams of helping animals began on the farm where he grew up, a lonely boy, tormented by kids at school.
When I went home after being beaten up and hugged Pirate, our farm dog, life made more sense. He was like a heart stent in the sense of emotions. He bypassed the other bad things and led me to a place of serenity or peace.
He tells us about some of the pets he's treated and the tortoise that almost led to his downfall. Noel's story after the news.
Hello, I'm Neil Nunes with the BBC News. The United States has begun its mass coronavirus vaccination campaign as nearly 3 million doses of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine are being distributed across the country. Nada Tawfik in New York has more details.
Shortly after 9 a.m. on Monday, an intensive care nurse at Long Island's Jewish Medical Center in Queens became the first person to be given the jab in the United States. Trucks and cargo planes are en route to deliver the vaccine across the country as cases continue to rise dramatically, and nearly 150 hospitals are set to receive it on Monday. Residents of nursing homes are expected to begin receiving the vaccine next week, and the campaign aims to reach 100 million people by April.
The British government is moving London to England's highest level of coronavirus restrictions, saying the rise in cases under the current rules threatens to overwhelm hospitals. From the start of Wednesday, all restaurants and cafes in the capital must close. Any mixing between households will be limited to certain outdoor spaces, but schools, shops and gyms will stay open. The Health Secretary Matt Hancock also told Parliament a new variant of coronavirus has been identified in England and is fast spreading. Jim Reid reports.
Matt Hancock said this new strain had been found in around 1,000 COVID cases in the southeast of England. Tests are now being carried out at Porton Down to see if it's associated with a recent spike in infections in the region. But he said there was nothing to suggest this mutation was more likely to cause serious disease or respond differently to a vaccine.
The formal process to certify Joe Biden's election victory is underway as the 538 members of the U.S. Electoral College publicly cast their ballots for the presidency. From Washington, Gary O'Donoghue.
The American Electoral College is a strange beast. It effectively is the body that elects the president and the vice president. So the individual states vote, their electors choose a slate of voters who then appoint the president and the vice president. This is normally a formal process, normally goes without any kind of notice whatsoever, but given the controversy around this election and the insistence by the president that he's not done with this election, this is a big day and another big milestone in his defeat.
The investigative website Bellingcat says it has evidence that Russian opposition activist Alexei Navalny was poisoned by an undercover Russian intelligence hit squad. Citing phone and travel records, Bellingcat says the FSB unit specializing in toxins and poisons had shadowed Mr. Navalny since 2017. It alleges the team followed him on 30 trips, including to Siberia, where he fell into a coma in August after being given the nerve agent Novichok. BBC News. The European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has highlighted movement in the post-Brexit talks, but said the final mile was the most essential one. Mrs. von der Leyen said the main sticking point remained fair competition. From Brussels, here's Kevin Connolly.
Time is short and getting shorter for a Brexit free trade deal, but Ursula von der Leyen was sounding relatively upbeat after the weekend decision to keep talking. She said there had been movement and that was good, but stressed that if the UK wanted seamless access to the EU single market, it would have to play by EU rules. She said the European side was fine with the architecture being built with the British, but still had questions about the detail. On the UK side, the government at one point sounded more positive, suggesting a no-deal outcome was merely possible, but then corrected itself, returning to the view that it was most likely.
The United States has for the first time accused Iran officially of direct involvement in the disappearance and presumed death of the former FBI agent Robert Levinson. The U.S. Treasury said that following new information, it was imposing sanctions on 2 officials in Iran's Interior Ministry who were implicated in Mr. Levinson's abduction. Robert Levinson disappeared in Iran 13 years ago. The adult website Pornhub has removed most of its videos by suspending all unverified accounts. Millions of items were affected by the move. It follows a row over illegal content. A recent press report said the site was infested by material related to rape and child sexual abuse. Heavy rain and fog have dampened the hopes of expectant Chileans trying to see a total solar eclipse. Several 100,000 tourists joined residents in the central region of Araucanía, but were frustrated by the conditions. BBC World News.
Hello, I'm Jo Fidgen, and this is Outlook, introducing you to inspiring people from all over the globe. Today, one for the animal lovers out there. Stories about friendly crocodiles and bionic cats and the remarkable people who care for them. First up, Noel Fitzpatrick, a pioneering veterinary surgeon who treats animals no one else thinks can be saved. He's a household name in the UK and Ireland, where he's from, because of his TV show The Super Vet, which shows him helping all manner of creatures. But his story begins with a different superhero, one he invented for himself as a lonely, unpopular child. He called him Vetman.
I was a big fan of superheroes like Wolverine and Batman, and my friends were animals because I lived in the middle of nowhere and I didn't relate to people very well and was getting bullied at school, so I didn't want to relate to those people. So all of those things together made me want to climb the chestnut tree and set Vetman on his adventures, and I just thought I could send him out across the world in his glowing cape, which was based on a Red Admiral butterfly, and he could save all the animals of the universe.
And what was his special superpower then? How did he do that? How did he fix them?
I'm so pleased that you're delving right to the nub of the matter. He was searching for medicines one day in a rainforest type region, and he found a meteor hole in which a star had fallen. And I had heard the phrase, love is in the stars. And when you're 8 and you hear that love is in the stars, well, if your mind is anything like mine, you're going to think, well, what if love is actually in a molecular structure inside a star? And so, like Iron Man, who has an inside glowing bit that is slowly decaying, Vetman internalized these molecules of unconditional love that fell from the stars into this meteor crater. His special power is that he interprets everything through that filter of unconditional love in his heart, which has fallen in the molecular structure of love from the stars.
Back on Earth, Noel felt only hatred from the bullies at school. Love came from animals, especially the family's sheepdog, Pirate.
It seemed to me that when I went home after being beaten up and hugged Pirate, our farm dog, in the cattle shed where he lived, that life made more sense. He was like a heart stent in the sense of emotions. He bypassed the other bad things and led me to a place of serenity or peace, which I took to be unconditional love.
You talk about Pirate living in the cattle shed. In fact, he was chained up pretty much all the time he wasn't working. He was a working animal. You were on a farm. Animals were not, creatures to hang out with and see as your friends. They were working beasts, weren't they?
Yeah. And hence feeling a little bit like an alien, as I'm sure many kids can relate to, whatever their sense of rewiredness is that society calls weirdness. You're right, he was chained up, and on a farm, it's assumed that the animals are going to be bred, reared, and slaughtered for meat. And it's therefore a rather functional attitude towards animals, which is normal in a farm. But I related to their pain, their sentience, and their needs, and what I perceived as their interpretation of the world we were living in. And I was drawn very much to trying to take care of that through their eyes.
So there you are. I have this picture of you as a young boy in the cattle shed with Pirate, the farm dog, and you're telling him all your tales of Vetman and how he's going around the world saving the animals and fitting bionic limbs to creatures everywhere, which was unheard of. I mean, where did this idea come from in your child's imagination?
Well, I was 10, 11 at that point, and the important thing about Vetman, actually, in retrospect, was that he rescued all the animals that were unwanted, the animals that were broken or that were thrown out. And he would also use things that were thrown out by the world. So I was inspired by space travel, and I was inspired by Wolverine, and I was inspired by X-Men. The